Hello, my name's Theo and welcome to our presentation. I'll be presenting on behalf of our other group members, Roz and Brad. So our presentation today is on current account deficits and whether or not they matter. So first off, what is the current account? Well, the current account is one of three components of the balance of payments, and it records the import and export of goods, services, income, and current unilateral transfers. So what determines the current account balance? It's a number of factors contribute to the balance, such as per capita income, output growth, fiscal balances, net foreign assets, economic openness, and demographic variables. In the case of Australia, for example, that might be natural resources such as iron ore. These determinants dictate the saving and investment patterns of a country and can be separated into the following components. First, on the savings side, we have private saving and public saving, and with investment we have residential investment and non-residential investment. Now, the relationship between savings, investment, and the current account is as follows. A country's savings surplus, which is on the left-hand side, is equal to its export surplus, if you like. So, on the left-hand side, if this figure is positive, it means that after domestic consumption and investment, a country has excess capacity. And what happens is, with the extra goods that it's produced and the services that it has available, once domestic demand is satisfied, that then is sold in the form of exports. So if this balance is positive, then the country is a net saver, and if it's negative, the country is a net borrower. On the right-hand side, as I said, we have exports and imports, and if this balance is positive, then a country is a net exporter, and if it's negative, then the country is a net importer. So how do we change the current account balance? Well, there's two ways. First is to raise GDP relative to national spending, and the second is to increase saving relative to domestic investment. Just on the first point, it's important to note that there's a few different ways this can happen. So you can either, but in order to raise GDP relative to national spending, you can either treat national spending as fixed and increase, say, the productivity of labour, and that's going to increase GDP, which in turn increases national savings, which means it then has more goods to export. Another way is you can keep GDP fixed and then reduce national spending, such as through budget cuts or whatever. And on the second, the same is true for the second point, increasing saving relative to domestic investment. You can either increase the savings rate, and that might be done through government, various government policies, fiscal policies, or you can decrease the level of domestic investment. So there's numerous ways you can go about achieving these two ends. So what is a current account deficit? Well, when a country spends or invests more than it saves, this excess spending or this excess consumption needs to be financed by importing from other countries. So if you're wanting to consume 100 microwaves a year, but you only can produce 80, well, the remaining 20 come from overseas, and that's what results in a current account deficit, where a country is, through its own production, unable to satisfy demand. So it's important to remember that when a current account balance is negative, then there's a corresponding positive value for the financial account. And what happens is, as we purchase goods from overseas markets, there's an accumulation of domestic currency abroad, and so with that currency, it can either be traded amongst other participants in foreign exchange markets, or it could be reinvested in the domestic market by foreign investors, and that's something that is rather important when it comes to considering whether or not a current account deficit is good or bad. So, is a current account deficit good or bad? Well, on the one hand, a current account deficit implies excess spending, which is a bad thing, as it means that we're dependent on other countries financing our own consumption. But on the other hand, developed countries such as the US have consistently run current account deficits successfully. So there is a bit of tension between the idea of whether it's good or bad. As it turns out, a current account deficit can mean either one of two things. It can imply a low level of saving, and as I said, that is a bad thing. However, it can also indicate strong economic growth. If a country is unable to meet its own demand because it's growing, then having to rely on to purchase those extra goods and services from overseas isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it contributes obviously to the country growing. And also that means that, as I've mentioned before, having a current account deficit means that there's a corresponding financial account surplus. And what that means is that other countries are investing in the domestic economy. So it depends. When you're looking at whether or not a current account deficit is a bad thing, you need to determine why we have the current account deficit. Is it because of low saving, or is it because of strong economic growth? Okay, what's a current account surplus? Well, a current account surplus is the opposite of a deficit. So when a country spends or invests less than it saves, it's going to have that excess production, which can then be sold to other countries. So what does this mean? Well, if the current account balance is positive, then we're going to have a corresponding negative balance on the financial account, meaning that the country is investing in foreign countries. So current account surplus, is it good or bad? Well, it can be viewed as a positive in terms of strong savings. However, a high level of saving can also imply a lack of investment opportunities domestically. And additionally, weaker currencies will reduce their imports as their currencies depreciate. So the demand for your excess production may fall if you're depending on weaker economies importing it. So a current account surplus can mean either a high level of saving or a slow rate of economic growth. What about exchange rates? Well, exchange rates determine the value of a home country's currency relative to its trading partners. So having a strong domestic currency means that imports are going to be relatively cheaper than domestic goods. And obviously, on the other side, a weak domestic currency is going to result in domestic goods being relatively cheaper than foreign goods. The problem with exchange rates is that when you're trying to determine, it's determining causation. Is it the case that a weaker currency is promoting your export industries, or is it because you've got a thriving export industry, or you've got a really good production industry that's causing the currency to weaken? So it's hard to determine what side causes which. But that's our overview of current account deficits. So now we're going to move on and have a look at some specific examples of the countries that we have looked at for our report. So we're going to do that by comparing current account balances in terms of GDP and looking at that alongside the annual growth in a country's GDP. So first off with Australia, as you can see here, as the GDP grows, you can see that there's also a corresponding increase in the current account balance, and that's a fairly consistent trend. So historically, Australia has run a current account deficit. This is because of two reasons. One is that foreigners acquire more Australian assets than Australians do, and secondly, domestic investment is greater than domestic saving. So the Australian current account deficit reflects the returns paid to foreign investors. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Australia has had strong economic growth over the past 20, 30 years. And so having, in this case, it's not so much that we have a slack savings. It's more that we have investment opportunities for overseas investors and a growing economy, which we need to finance by importing. Also, it's just a note that the current government is devaluing the currency in order to promote our exports in the face of the slowing down in investment in the mining boom. Moving on to the US, you can see there that the US has run a current account deficit, and this has been largely driven by the dependence on foreign oil and imports being relatively cheaper than domestically produced goods. And this second point is a cause of a lot of trade disputes between between US and China, as China has a exchange rate policy which devalues their currency, promoting their export industries. But the effect of this is that it makes, from the American perspective, it makes imports much cheaper than the domestically produced goods, so their manufacturing industries are suffering as a result of that. So now moving on to China. China has run a current account surplus for many years, and that's partly due to the fact that they've had record growth over the past 30 years. It's interesting to note that first off, that the export industry, as I mentioned before, is supported by their exchange rate policy. There has been a recent decline, and that's attributed partly to an appreciating currency and also due to increases in domestic investment and government spending. For the UK has also run a current account deficit, and this has been due to a number of factors. High employment is one. As America, their dependence on foreign oil, and also the war in Iraq and Afghanistan has increased government spending and reduced savings. So the last country is South Africa. South Africa is one of our developing countries, and they've traditionally run a current account deficit. And South Africa has faced a number of challenges in terms of their economy and foreign trade. The apartheid policy, which obviously has ended now, but the effects of that are still present. It's resulted in high unemployment, high crime rates, and these factors have hurt domestic investment and decreased government saving. So that's the end of our presentation. I hope you've learned a thing or two, and thank you very much for your time.